Okay, so chapter 2 of Hamilton, and we're going to go over some of the material we touched upon last class, which is not a bad thing. Repetition is always a good thing in pedagogy. So we know that Sanskrit then is a member of the Indo-European language family, and so the Vedic texts are actually the oldest literature in the Indo-European language family, and arguably in literary history. So the mainstream religion in the Vedic age consisted of the performance of yajna, sacrifices. The Sanskrit term for sacrifice is yajna, which consisted of sort of brick fire altars arranged in certain ways, and in which offerings were made to celestial beings, the devas. Cognate, we know what a cognate is when words sound the same in two languages. Cognate with divine, div, to shine. Devas, the shining ones, the celestial, they're radiant, celestial beings. Not liberated beings, just beings with very good karma. In later Hinduism, they construed as beings of very good karma, that sort of because of their good karma, they take birth. The celestials, they don't stay there eternally. After their karma runs out, they come back down. But anyway, we don't get all of that in the very, very old Vedic texts. There's not even a mention of reincarnation, in fact, until the Upanishads. Mainstream religion then, like as it was pretty much everywhere in the world, certainly the Greco-Roman world, Mesoamerica, China, Africa, consisted of offering things into fire for super normal beings. So that was the actual mainstream Vedic religion. So yoga, as we're encountering yoga, philosophical speculation, sort of going on in the margins. So we see you have a picture in Hamilton on page 21 of a modern day Vedic sacrifice. You'll see in this particular, and of course there were many different kinds of sacrifices. There were sort of state-run ones for before a battle or something, and then the daily sacrifices that were enjoined on the Brahmana caste. They had to do every morning, and then there were sacrifices that were performed if one had a desire. So there are different kinds of sacrifices, and each one was sort of aimed at a different purpose. So, but here we see a classical Vedi. Vedi is the sort of sacrificial arena or area on page, and you see this is inside someone's house. So this would be a daily sacrifice of a Brahmana. That person there preparing in the photograph would be a Brahmana, and over the page you see the same thing from a different angle. And there would be typically in the sort of conventional yajnas, there would be three different fire pits. You'll see them in that picture there. The square one is the Ahavaniya at the bottom there. That's where the offerings were actually placed into in order to be transferred to the gods. And then there would be the semicircular one on the left of the photo. That's the Dakshinagni, the southern fire. Agni is fire. Again, another cognate. Cognate with the English word ignite. So Agni. So you see the connection with fire. Agni is the god of fire, both the celestial. He has a celestial form, and he has a material form of fire itself. So many entities in the Vedic understanding had both physical forms and celestial forms. For example, the Ganga, the river Ganges, the Ganga is both a river and a goddess, and the Yamuna and the Vedas are both books, and they're also personalities. So some of that comes out in later Hinduism. But even in the earlier period, we see Agni is both the fire and a celestial being. So three fire pits there, and then the northern one, the round one there, is the Garhapatya, and that's where the sacred fire is brought from the homestead, and it's placed in here, and from there it lights the other fires. So the actual offering one is the one in the front of the picture, the Ahavaniya. That's where things are offered, grains. You know, in the earlier period, animals were also sacrificed. If you read the Brahmana texts, there are many mentions of animals being sacrificed. And of course, we've heard of there's the great Ashvamedha sacrifice that warriors used to perform. It's in the Mahabharata text after the Pandavas had won the war, they perform the Ashvamedha, where they allow a horse to wander around the neighboring kingdoms, and then if the neighboring king didn't want to pay homage to the king that had aspirations for being like an emperor, a king of kings, then if the neighboring kings didn't want to accept that, they would capture the horse, and there'd be a battle between the two armies of the neighboring king and the king sending out the horse. But if the king sending out the horse was powerful, as in the case of the Pandavas, then many of the neighboring kings just accepted that. They'd offer tribute, and they'd let the horse wander through their kingdom. Of course, the horse must have been directed in some sort of way. So we see, actually, after the Mahabharata war, Yudhisthira, the elder Pandava, sends Arjuna with the horse, and in some instances he has to fight neighboring kingdoms, and others not. But anyway, that horse eventually gets sacrificed. That's the great Ashvamedha. And I think if you perform 100 Ashvamedha sacrifices, you get to be the chief of in later times, in the Puranic time, you get chief of the celestials, Indra, who was kind of like the martial leader of the celestials. But anyway, so in the early Vedic period, the religion consisted of maintaining the cosmic order. There was a sense that the fire sacrifice was fundamental to maintaining cosmic order. Right? The Dharma. Dharma is a nature of something. Everything has a Dharma. And we see that term will emerge in different ways in Indian philosophy. Is the nature of something is its quality, its essential quality. So, for example, here's a pen. So the Dharma of the pen is that which allows you to write. That's what defines it as a pen, as opposed to, let's say, a glass. This has a different Dharma. This is a container of liquid that can be used to drink. So something's fundamental nature. Of course, in the Gita, that becomes the Dharma of a person. We have duties that correspond to our fundamental natures. We'll get to that in the Gita, right? So also professions ideally correspond to our inclinations, the nature of this particular mind that we have and this body that we have. Some people are best suited for, I don't know, academic work. Others are more activists and martially oriented and want to fight injustice. Others have a inclination to business. They're always thinking of profit, and others, basically others like to work with their hands or in other types of ways. So these then become the dharmas in terms of profession in the Gita. But dharma can also, people have many dharmas. You have a dharma as a son towards your parents, a duty. There's an essential quality of being a son. You have you're supposed to serve your parents and vice versa, right? There's the dharma of the parent to protect the child, and the dharma of a husband to a wife. So dharma is the fundamental nature characteristic of something. And there was a dharma of the universe in the Vedic understanding. The sun rises and it sets, and rains, provide water for agriculture. So things have their dharma. But in order to ensure that the dharma of the universe functioned in an idyllic way, sacrifices had to be performed. So there was a dharma of humans to perform these yajnas. The yajnas are the sacrifices, like you see in the and some of them are just daily sacrifices. You just have to do it. So and because of these sacrifices, then the universe was regulated and continued in a regulated way. The rains provided rain, the sun provided sunshine, and the universe functioned in as idyllic a way as possible. Part of that was part of that sort of process of universal functioning. The human was in some ways a part of that. And the part that the human played was the performance of Vedic sacrifice. And so the sacrifices are described in the Vedic literatures. Remember, we spoke about the 4 stratas. The oldest strata, and we can have a quick look at page. I think she lines them up in one of these pages here. If you look at page 27, the oldest strata of the Vedas, and within that oldest strata of the Veda, there are 4 Vedas. Don't get confused with the 4 strata themselves, and the first strata, which has 4 texts within it. And those are the 4 Vedas. And then there are the Brahmana and Aranyaka texts, 2 more stratas, and the Upanishads. And each of the Vedas has certain Brahmanas and Aranyakas and Upanishads associated with each respective Veda. So different Upanishads would be in one of the lineages coming from the 4 Vedas, and they would have family priests then associated with each lineage, and so there would be different Brahmana lineages and families, and they were responsible for the memorization and the recitation of those texts at the sacrifice and the perpetuation of those texts. Okay, so this was the Vedic ritual, highly, highly, highly intricately complex, and everything had to be memorized. The mantras, and there were mantras chanted during the sacrifice from the 4 Vedas. It was from the 3 Vedas, actually, from the first 3 Vedas, not the 4th so much, not the Atharva so much, but the Rig, the Yajur and the Sama. Mantras would be from the Samhita, from the hymns, and they would be recited. It might sound something like this: Agnimehele purohitam yagnasyam devam ritvicham hotaram, and so on. So these would be recited. It had to be perfect meter. Right? It's 3 pitches, middle, up, and down. Agnimehele, only 3 notes. And there's rules for when you go up and when you go down, depending on whether the word is a conjunct or heavy syllables or light syllables. So very, very intricate sort of ritualistic culture. And the mantras had to be recited perfectly. If you made one mistake, you had to scrap the whole sacrifice and start all over again, right? Which wouldn't be fun if you were on like day 5 of the sacrifice. So this was the Vedic ritualistic culture, and a lot of the traditions that we're going to look at emerge on the boundaries of this, on the margins of this, and in some ways critique it. Some just sever their connection with the Vedic culture and they go off. They eventually become Buddhists and Jains and the Charvakans. But some kind of nominally accept it, but yet sort of relegate it to a lower type of religiosity. They relegate it to a type of religiosity where, for materialistic people that have desires for material things, are associated with Vedic ritualism in some of the later traditions, but not in all. So we have one school called the Mimamsa, one of the 6 schools of philosophy that set out to perpetuate the Vedic rites, and on the grounds that the Vedas are eternal. Why do we perform these sacrifices? Just because we are told to. Because of the Vedic injunctions. The Vedas have injunctions. They say injunction means you must do something, an imperative. So therefore, the Mimamsa school say we perform these sacrifices because the Vedas are eternal, they're divine, and they're eternal texts, and therefore they've always been. They were never composed. There's no beginning to them, and they are revelation. But Mimamsas don't believe in a god. Other schools also accept eternal Vedas, but they say other schools might say they're revealed by God, but not the Mimamsas. The Mimamsas, one of the 6 schools, right? So we get familiar with that word. They are the ritualists, and as the old Vedic religion starts to fade a little bit, and sort of Buddhism and Jainism and later Hindu traditions emerge and start to resist some of the Vedic claims, or sort of start to supplant them with knowledge traditions and devotional traditions, and the Vedic the Vedic imperative becomes less. People subscribe less to it. So the Mimamsas have to sort of support that, the flagging tradition. And so they become great philosophers in their own right, and especially in philosophy of language and meaning and hermeneutics. We defined these terms last class. Because the Vedas are eternal, there's a consequence of that. The Vedas are texts, and they contain words. So if the Vedas are eternal, that means words, language is eternal. The Sanskrit language is eternal. And that means, what's the relationship between a word and its object then? It must be eternal. If the Vedas are eternal, and words like tree and fire and sacrifice are in the Vedas, then that means that word is eternally related with the object. So therefore they develop, so they have to support this. And so they develop, rules of grammar. How do you interpret the text? The grammar comes, many of the later sciences, Vedic sciences, they come from this ritualistic culture. Grammar being one. And the Paninian grammar is one of the most sophisticated grammatical analyses ever in human history. I mean, when European scholars discovered it, they were amazed. And in fact, it triggered, in some ways, it contributed to the development of Indo-European historical linguistics, which was a huge field in early 20th century academe, comparative linguistic, comparing the languages of Greek and Rome with, and not just linguistics, but also then this whole quest, well, where do these people come from? It becomes tied up with nationalism. So we have this Vedic culture, and all of these, so everything was memorized. It was considered to be a flaw. Writing was considered to be we think of writing as a step forward in human civilization, right? We think, what are the big steps forward in human civilization? Agriculture and the wheel and fire and writing. But actually, the ancient sages of India considered that a weakness, a prop. The human memory could no longer remember because of weakness, because of time, and therefore grammar and therefore writing has to be invented. So it's not, so priestly families would memorize the text within their lineages and a massive amount of information. And you still find people in India today, or at least you certainly did 20, when I first went to India in the 70s. You still found Brahmanas, like, for example, knew the whole Mahabharata, 100,000 verses by heart. Quite remarkable. So all these texts were memorized, the rules of grammar were memorized, and then also subsidiary sciences, such as mathematics, right? You had to perform your Vedic, you see the picture of the sacrificial pits on page 21. Well, they had to be precise for the sacrifice to be efficient. So actually you had to have angles and geometry emerges from the need to construct perfect fire sacrifice. In fact, Pythagoras' theorem was known, we call it Pythagoras' theorem, was known earlier by the Indians. And so mathematics emerges from the Vedic requirements, and astronomy, because everything had to be done, sacrifices had to be done exactly at the right time, with the position of the moon and the stars and so forth, the constellations. So astronomy emerges from that, observation of the heavens, so that the science of astronomy emerges, grammar emerges, mathematics emerges, pronunciation, etymology, the etymologies of words, so kind of historical linguistics, really. So all of these knowledge systems, many of them have their roots in the Vedic sacrifice, and the whole notion of karma. Karma now comes to be associated with cause and effect. Well, why did you do a fire sacrifice? You did it so the rains would be produced, so that the sun would rise in the mornings. And so in this world, things for this world, this worldly things, but also if you were an ideal Vedic citizen, then you performed your sacrifices, and in the next life you'd go to the celestial realms. So that means there is a connection between the performance of the sacrifice and a later result. It's not like the rain's going to come immediately. It's not going to, you throw something in the fire, all of a sudden, thunder's going to occur. Maybe it did in some instances, but the results are not necessarily immediate. And so therefore, in fact, one of the words for karma is apurva. One is adrishta, that there's an adrishta, unseen, a bond between the sacrifice you're performing and the effect that it produces. If you do your sacrifice exactly right, you chant the mantras precisely according to the traditions, and highly intricate, all the implements have to be lined up in a certain way, and the priests have to be reciting in certain synchronicity. So the three Vedas, so the three priests from the three lineages had to be reciting the mantras from their particular Vedic texts, right? The Rig, the Yajur, the Samar, and then they had to be one Brahman overseeing everything, and distances between everything had to be performed precisely right. Okay? I mean, it's a bit like computer technology, right? Here I am sitting in front of a computer. If I press the wrong key, I'm going to mess up my whole document. I mean, someone who doesn't know computer technology could say, well, what's the difference between this key and that key? Well, there's a lot of difference. One it might erase the whole document. So likewise, from our point of view, we think, well, what's the difference if you go Agnime Hele or Agnime Hele? If you make one pitch difference, well, it made a lot of difference from the understanding of the Brahmins of that day and age. Okay, so it was highly meticulously precise, and nothing comparable to that has been revealed in human history in any other culture to that degree of precision and specificity. So, and everything memorized. Okay, so that she discusses some of that. So the sacrifice was for perpetuating the cosmos on its highest level. So some sacrifices were just connected to that, and then you just had to do them just like we have to eat, and we have to go to the bathroom, and we have to do certain things to survive. So in the Vedic understanding, you had to perform the Vedic sacrifice for the universe to continue functioning in an ideal way. So that was on the highest level, but there were other kinds of sacrifices that were specific. Maybe you wanted a son or a daughter or a child, or a king might want a victory, a sacrifice before a battle. So they were specific types of sacrifice. So some were specific, done according to desire. Others were enjoined. You just had to do them every day. and so on. Okay, so this is the Vedic sacrifice, and so we get the word Dharma, the earliest usage of the word Dharma, which is the very nature of the universe, and part of that, the Dharma, the well-being of the universe, cosmic order, you could almost say. That the Dharma, the universe, its nature is to function in an orderly sort of way. That was its Dharma. But part of that was then, part of that Dharma spilled over into humans, and humans had to participate in that Dharma by the Vedic sacrifice. So obviously we think a completely different way now, but it's a fascinating period of human history, and it wasn't just confined to India. It seemed like the ancient world had this understanding that we were intricately connected with nature, but also that nature itself, there was personalities behind nature, celestial beings that we can't see with your eyes. Although in the Mahabharata epic, actually, it says that in the, that we have this idea of the four ages, like the Greeks had the idea of the four ages: the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the Bronze Age. Well, ancient Indians had, in a later time, in the the Mahabharata, post-Vedic times or late Vedic times, the idea that there are four ages of human history, really, four periods, and they're on the decline. Not we like to think we're progressing, but they would think not from a technological point of view, but from a spiritual point of view and a cultural point of view, things are on the decline. And so the Satya Yuga, the Treta Yuga. The Yuga is an age, so there's four ages: the Satya Yuga, Yuga, Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and the Kali Yuga. And the Mahabharata says in the earliest days, the gods would actually attend. The celestials would actually physically come down and sit around there, and they would attend these sacrifices. And then as humans became less spiritually qualified, more tainted by the degenerating age, then the gods stopped appearing in their actual celestial forms. But anyway, she doesn't discuss that. I'm just throwing that out there as a point of interest. The Vedic sacrifice, okay, cosmic order, and highly intricate. So from the four strata of text, the Vedas are hymns that you chant at the sacrifice. The oldest of the four strata, the four Vedas, certainly three of them, especially three of them, are hymns that are recited during the sacrifice. And each Veda has its family lineage associated with it. And the next strata of texts are Brahmana texts. Remember, Brahmanas are both texts and the caste of people that recite them and preserve them and perform the rituals, and later on they become the teachers and the pandits and the pujaris in the temple, people that do puja, worship in the temple. Earlier periods, they perform the Vedic rituals. The Brahmana texts are prose texts. You don't recite them during the sacrifice, but they tell you how to do the sacrifice, where to sit, how to line up the implements. I mean, they're kind of like technological manuals. A bit like, in the old days when the computers first came out, they give you a huge manual, and I don't know who read them. I suppose some computer nerds read them. Well, they were Vedic ritual nerds back in the Vedic age, that they knew all the details of which implements to use and how to build the fire pits according to whatever the need of that sacrifice was, and distances, and who recited what and when. And there was a sort of overseer of ceremony who was also called a Brahmana. So those are the Brahmana texts. And then the Upanishads, remember, the Aranyakas are a bit of Brahmana. They contain material from the Brahmanas, and they contain material from the Upanishads. Okay, so this is Vedic Sanskrit, the hymns. And then she in page 23, Hamilton, in the box there, gives us the etymology of Sanskrit. Krit means put together. Past passive. Kra is to do, to make. So sam means together, well. So Samskrita is the sort of a language that's well put together, well formed, well constructed. So that's something you might be interested in. And it's considered to be the language of the gods. And in fact, I'm teaching another course this semester, Sanskrit for introductory. And the name of our reader, our Sanskrit introduction to Sanskrit book is Devavani Praveshika, the Devavani, the language of the gods. So as with other religions, then the celestial beings are thought to, other religions say, well, God speaks Hebrew or Arabic or whatever, but in the Sanskrit tradition, then the devas, the celestials, speak Sanskrit. Okay, so then the Brahmana caste, and then of course, along with the sacrifice, you need to protect the sacrifice. So sacrifice has to be performed by ritual specialists. So they become a caste, and they preserve the knowledge of the sacrifice and the hymns. They memorize them and the rituals. All that information is handed down in lineages. So they become a caste of ritual specialists. And then, of course, society, they're part of society. So society has to have other members. Any society can't just have ritualists. There needs to be administrators and warriors to protect the Vedic culture. There need to be merchants that distribute food and trade and see to the material well-being of the culture. There needs to be, people that work in different capacities, work for the other castes. That people, trades, carpenters and people that work with their hands. So any society has sort of basic workforce that are work for others, and then you have merchants that own their own businesses and organize trade, and in the Indian tradition also they were land owners, and they were sort of the farmers, not the workers on the land, but the owners and sort of visionaries for husbandry and agriculture. So you had the four castes. So then that all becomes part of the Dharma. The Vedic, even though the core of it might be the Vedic sacrifice, but by extension, that required also civic order to be performed in a healthy manner, in a safe manner. So then you had to have a larger civic order, and that also, then Dharma then becomes associated with people's caste duties. If everyone does their duties, so the civic order is maintained in the idyllic possible way, and the Vedic sacrifice can continue safely and unthreatened, and in that way the cosmos can continue in its idyllic state. Okay, so this notion of the Vedic sacrifice, its connections with the cosmos, has all kinds of larger repercussions, and the word Dharma is central to it all, as is karma. Karma is the actual work involved, and if you do work, then you receive an effect, and there is a bond which you might not be able to see. Like anything, you put a seed in the ground and you can't see the tree, but the tree comes out of it. It's an effect from the seed you put in. So likewise, you perform an act, and it adrishta, there's the unseen bond. Apurva, another word for it is apurva. Something happens which didn't exist before. So you make it rain, for example. Well, it didn't exist before, but then you do your Vedic ritual, and then the result is something which didn't exist before, but it exists. Once you do your ritual, then that effect occurs at some point, and it rains. Okay, so these are different words, what we now call karma, and that word then spills into Buddhism, Jainism, and all the Hindu traditions, which is just action and reaction on any kind of action and reaction, but it has its roots in the Vedic sacrifice. And at that time, rather than the word karma, there were two other words that were used more frequently. One was the adrishta, the unseen one, because karma is unseen. You can't see the effect until it comes. You don't know when it's going to come, for example. So it's unseen. And apurva, something comes which didn't exist before. Right? I act, and now an effect comes into being. It didn't exist before. The minute I act, though, it exists. So therefore, apurva, it didn't exist before I acted. So you don't have to worry about those terms, but just as a point of interest, what we now call karma had older terms associated with it, specifically adrishta and apurva. Okay, so then we had, then we see then, as time goes on, when I say we see in the literature. Okay, we're sort of, how can we really know what people thought other than that what's preserved in the literary record? We don't know what people were thinking 5,000 years ago when they were performed the Vedic sacrifices. What was their logic? I mean, these were incredibly smart people. There's no question about it. Their sophistication in grammar and astronomy, and they, like I said, they knew what we shouldn't be calling it Pythagoras' theorem, because the Indians had it centuries before. But anyway, clearly brilliant analytical minds at work here. So there was some logic that they saw in this Vedic sacrifice. They weren't primitive people. We like to think, that's just our ego. Every culture thinks that its cultural moment is the highest cultural moment ever. That's just human ego. It's just the nature of human ego. So when we try to sort of, we try to obviously we see things differently now. We see things more through the lens of science and technology. So trying to understand, how is it that for 1,000 years and more, 1,500 years, people were doing these Vedic sacrifices very seriously, and they were great philosophers, great men. We know that from the literature. So what was their, how was that maintained for so long by these sophisticated thinkers? It's an intriguing thought, but obviously there's no way we can reclaim that understanding other than what we find in the literature. So we're obviously archaeology is there, but it's very hard to read. What are you going? You're not going to find an archaeological fire pit. You might, but you still don't know what was the logic of the people that performed these rituals. What were they thinking? But we have literature, and in the case of Sanskrit, we have more literature than any other Indo-European language. Actually, certainly in the older, well, actually, in any. There's more preserved in any classical language of the world. There's more information preserved in Sanskrit than anything else. Greek, Latin, all put together, as far as I know. All the other languages put together. There's more in Sanskrit in pre-modern times, prior to the printing press. But then we begin to see actual speculation emerge in the literature, right? So we should be careful about saying, dating the literature and then saying, okay, speculation begins at this date, right, based on that language, because we don't know prior to that. All we can say is that it emerges in the literature. More sort of what we now call cosmological speculation, early philosophical speculation as to, well, okay, what is this karma? What is this unseen connection between action and reaction? We begin to see sort of thinkers theorizing this, and okay, if I do a sacrifice, well, and then I go to the celestial realm in my next life, well, what precisely is it that's going there? Not the body. What is it that's going to the next? What is it about of me or of any person that's going to a celestial realm if I'm a good Vedic citizen and I do my fire sacrifice? So then we begin to see speculation about the Ātman, the self, the deep level self. And then one of the earliest speculative passages, which is so beautiful, from the early Rig Veda. The Rig Veda is the oldest of the texts, is on page 26. And, scholars often identify this as, just a beautiful example of early metaphysical. It's metaphysical speculation. There was neither non-existence nor existence then, the beginning. There was neither the realm of space nor the sky which is beyond. What stirred? Where? In whose protection? Was there water bottomlessly deep? Right? What stirred? Remember Aristotle? One of the arguments for God, there must be someone that moves matter. There must be someone that caused a big bang, we might say nowadays. What made it? What triggered a big bang? Something must come from the outside to trigger it. Because if the trigger was inherent in it, then it would have triggered it'd be triggering all the time if it was part of its nature. So if it suddenly just triggered at some point, well, there must be an outside trigger, we might say, but Aristotle would call it a prime mover. Well, right here in the verse, what stirred? What made things move? Right? Something must have stirred matter into evolving into the universe that we see. Right? And whose protection? Is there God? Was there water? Right? Water, that reminds us of Genesis. In the beginning there was water. Second, there was neither death nor immortality then before creation. There was no distinguishing sign of night nor day. That one breathed. So we have the sense of someone, a being. Okay, kind of personal. Windless by its own impulse. Other than that, there was nothing beyond. Darkness was hidden by darkness in the beginning, with no distinguishing sign. All this was water. Notice the notion of water at the beginning. Again, overlapping with what we find in Genesis, right at the beginning of Genesis. The life force that was covered with emptiness, that one arose through the power of heat. And here we get the sense of heat, that becomes tapas in yoga, discipline. We're going to see that word occur when we get to yoga. Who really knows, right? Who knows what happened at the beginning? Who will here proclaim it? Who's going to say, I know what the absolute truth is. I know what was there in the beginning, what caused it all. Who will, it's a child. Who was there? Who will here proclaim it? Whence was it produced? What caused this creation? Whence is this creation? The devas, the gods we were talking about, right, recipients of Vedic offerings, they came afterwards with the creation of the universe, right? They themselves are created beings, so they're products of creation. They're not the cause. Who then knows whence it has arisen? So notice how non-dogmatic this is. It's not assertive. It's just human thinking. This is just beautiful kind of cosmological musing. Whence this creation has arisen, perhaps it formed itself, right? That would be a materialist would say. We don't have to posit there's a God. Maybe it just came about just by its own nature, svabhava. Perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. The one who looks down on it. So now we get the sense of a God. That's going to become very important in later Vedanta, some Vedanta lineages. The one who looks down on it in the highest heaven. The heavens of the Devas. What's the highest one? Only he knows. But look at this. Well, perhaps he does not know. Maybe God doesn't know. Look at this. Rig Veda 10:29. Isn't that beautiful? So in terms of dates, Rig Veda can, scholars sometimes date it 12th century BCE, sometimes 15th century BCE. I think some Vedicists, Michael Witzel, I believe, in Harvard, was willing to go back possibly as far as 2000 BCE. Of course, this is academic datings. Always remember, for the tradition, these are eternal. All this dating business is all a modern sort of historical way of looking at things. And so the Vedas will be dated out of, say, 15th century to 12th century, or perhaps even with some, even earlier than that. And then you'd have the Upanishads around the 5th century, right? We have 4 strata. So let's say of the Vedic canon, all right, everything of the rest of it is later Hinduism. But the actual Vedic canon, Vedas, let's say 1500 BC. Let's say Upanishads 5th century BC, so you have 1,000 years approximately, And then we have the other 2 strata we tuck in there somehow. So Brahmanas, whatever, 8th century, Aranyakas, maybe Brahmanas a bit older than that. Aranyakas, 6th, 7th in the Upanishads, 5th, 4th century. Okay, so you'll find different dates. A lot of Indian scholars in India tend to prefer older dates, and there seems to be a general, more of a tendency to push the dates back. We're looking at philosophy, so we're not really historians that we need to be concerned about all that. But just so you have a sense. Okay, and then on page 27, you see the 4 Vedas and their various Upanishads that we are going to be reading, associated. So the Kaushitaki is associated with the Rig Veda, so that family would not only memorize all the hymns of the Rig Veda, but memorize the Kaushitaki Upanishad, and then there would be Brahmanas and Aranyakas in that lineage. She hasn't listed them because this is just not relevant for us, but they would also have certain Brahmanas. Each of the 4 Vedas would have certain Brahmanas, and the other lineages would have different Brahmanas, different Aranyakas, and different Upanishads. Here she's listed the Upanishads. Okay? So then we get the Upanishads when we get this speculation becomes much deeper now. And then what is this? And then much more less interest in the ritual. It's not rejected, but it becomes relegated to a sort of secondary concern. And often associated with just the material needs, not high-level philosophical spiritual needs, which is pertain to the Ātman, and not just rain. What's the point? Okay, you do your ritual, it rains, fine. And then what? The grass grows, the cows eat the grass, you get lots of milk from the cows, drink your milk, and then what? Next day you have to do it all over again. So then there's a sense that that's kind of true and real, but somewhat mundane, somewhat pertaining to the lower requirements of embodied existence. Much more attention then directed to the Upanishads, in the Upanishads to the Ātman, and more speculation. Okay, so we're going to be spending 3 sessions or so. Remember, we're right now doing a mini overview of all of Indian philosophy. Then we're going to go back in and look at the 6 schools. So now we're getting a bird's eye view, and we're going to revisit some of the things that we encounter here in the texts, the 6 sutra texts. A sutra is a type of text that is used for encoding technical information. A sutra. So we have Vedānta Sutra, Yoga Sutra, Nyaya Sutra, Mimamsa Sutra. So sutra is a genre of writing, a type of writing. Like the Vedas are a type of writing, they're poetry, they're hymns to the gods, so it's a genre. Like in English, we have epic literature, we have poetic literature, we have technical, scientific way of writing. These are different styles of writing, different genres of writing. So the Veda is a genre, they're hymns. The Brahmanas are a genre, they're prose, technical, right? And then the sutras, which we'll talk a lot more about. They emerge, she hasn't discussed them yet, so let's not say too much about it prematurely. But the sutras then, because most of our course is going to be reading primary material from the actual six so-called schools, each have their sutra text, or 5 of them do anyway. And the Sankhya Sutras is lost, but we'll have the oldest kind of substitute for the Sankhya Sutras, the Sankhya Karika. So that will be the rest of our course. Right now we're doing an overview. I'm going to shoot through Hamilton and just get a sense of bird's eye view of the whole landscape. Okay, now in the Upanishads we have 2 tendencies there. Here Hamilton, I don't think, has done a good job. She gives us these 2 terms in page 29 of monism and monotheism. Okay, and there might be various ways of defining it. These terms, the way we'll be using them in this course is monism is the idea that there's one truth, impersonal truth, that pervades all reality. And we'll call that Brahman. Well, the Upanishads call that Brahman. It's the one truth that supports everything. And Jamadya Syayataha, the Vedānta Sutra defines it, that from which creation and maintenance of the universe and dissolution of the universe springs, emanates from it. So Brahman is the support of all of this. And monism is the idea that the consciousness, the Ātman, that survives death, let's say a liberated Ātman, right? Let's say an Ātman that becomes liberated from the cycle of rebirth, right? A lot of our schools are going to be, that's going to be the ultimate goal of a school. Not the Mimamsas. For them, the goal is celestial realm. But the other schools actually accept the goal of moksha, liberation, from the cycle of action-reaction, like karma. You act and then reaction, and then when you die, all the reactions haven't come to you, right? Many of them are just in storage. So then you have to come back to get those reactions. And of course, coming back, you create new actions, and which generate new reactions, and so that you're trapped in this sort of cycle of samsara, it's sometimes called, the cycle of birth and death. So at least 5 of the 6 schools, and even Mimamsa later on, the ritual school, the ritualists, subscribe to an ultimate goal of liberation. Okay, so that's called various things: moksha, mukti. The Buddhists call it nirvana, but so do early Hindus call it nirvana. The Gita calls it nirvana. So these are terms that mean the same thing. That nature of that moksha or mukti or nirvana may be construed differently by the schools, but the idea of liberation is a unifying feature. Anyone accepting karma, pretty much, and reincarnation, then accepts the notion of liberation from that cycle of reincarnation. It's not seen to be a desirable state of affairs, as we'll encounter. Any kind of body has its problems. Even good karma, even if you have a good body and good quality of life, but you still get old, you still die, you still have to suffer diseases and anxieties and so forth. So any kind of embodied existence is not going to be seen as the ultimate goal of life, just to keep recycling back. Now, 2 terms, monism and monotheism. So monism is the idea that the liberated soul just merges into Brahman, and it ceases to be an individual. Right now, I'm an individual, I'm sitting here, you're sitting listening to this, and I'm not you, you're not me. And monism posits that actually this sense of separateness is because of these coverings, this body and the mind that cover our souls, but our Atmans. We're going to start using the term Atman. But when the Atman becomes liberated, what happens to it? It merges into Brahman, a bit like a drop of water, a raindrop hitting the ocean, right? It looks like a drop, an individual, but the minute it hits the ocean, what happens to its individuality? The water content remains the same, but it just emerges into the larger body of water, the ocean. So what does it lose then? It loses individuality. So monism is one. When that drop of water hits the ocean, it's one with the ocean. It's not like it's a drop in the ocean. That's monism. And we see those tendencies in the Upanishads, and she is kind of presenting the Upanishads as monistic, which is incorrect. And she should know better, Hamilton, because within the Upanishads we also have monotheism, which is also, she has the term there in the box, but she doesn't seem to be stressing it in her narrative on page 29. She says, Brahman is the equivalent of an impersonal absolute. Well, it is for some Vedanta. It's not for a number of other Vedanta traditions. It's not impersonal at all. Brahman is a person. Let me get to that. So monotheism, we know what monism is. Drop of water merges, soul, Ātman, merges into Brahman when it's liberated. What about monotheism? Well, monotheism is same Brahman, but monotheists say, no, Brahman is not impersonal. It's a personal God. It's a personal Ishvara, is the term we'll encounter, Ishvara. When we get to the Gita, Ishvara will be called Bhagavan. That's the Bhagavad Gita is Bhagavan. It's the song of Bhagavan. Gita is a song. Bhagavad Gita is one of the texts on our syllabus. So, and Patanjali calls that the same being. When we want to talk about a personal God, we can use the term Ishvara, which is more of a philosophical term, or we can use the term Bhagavan, same thing, Ishvara Bhagavan, just like Ātman Purusha, same thing, Ishvara Bhagavan, same thing. But we use the term Bhagavan when we want to talk more strongly about Ishvara's personality. So Bhagavan, that in the Hindu tradition, then God manifests in these personal forms like Shiva and Vishnu and Krishna. So we'll look more at that when we get to the Gita. But if we're just dealing with philosophy, we don't want to talk about God's personality, but just about the idea that there is a God, because there's no good talking about God's personality to, say, a Buddhist or a Jain or even a Mimamsa if they don't accept God in the first place. What's the point of talking about someone's personality if they don't accept that that person exists? So in philosophical literature, then we tend to find the term Ishvara for those who promote the idea, no, there's an intelligent being behind creation. There's intelligence, and creation isn't just random. And so then the term Ishvara gets favored. So those who believe in an Ishvara then believe that the Ātman, an ultimate Ishvara, and there's a reason why I'm saying ultimate Ishvara, because some monists accept that there's an Ishvara, but not ultimate. We won't discuss that now, but we will when we get to Vedānta. So I'll just leave that dangling for now. But those that accept an ultimate Ishvara, that Ishvara is eternal and ultimate, not secondary, accept that the soul is an individual, eternally, not like the drop of water that merges in the ocean, never merges into anything, it retains its individuality. And so there's a plurality of souls, eternally. And so we can call them monotheists. And so those are two terms here, monism and monotheism. Monism, ultimately there's no God and no anything, there's an impersonal truth, Satchidananda, eternal blissful consciousness. And we'll talk more about that. There's qualities, Satchidananda. We'll talk more about those when we get to Vedānta. A lot of these terms, I'm throwing them out there first time. Remember the quick intro, and then we'll go later on. So don't panic if you didn't get them all. You'll certainly know what Satchidananda means when we get to Vedānta, right? So don't worry. So those schools, monists are those who Ātman merges into an impersonal Brahman. Impersonal is the key word there. Monotheists, personal. Brahman is a personal being. And the soul doesn't merge, and it remains an individual, doesn't merge. And there's a relationship of love in the liberated state between two entities. Okay, so that's a big difference in the nature, in how liberation is understood. So then she finishes up the chapter with speaking about the Upanishads. We don't need to say too much about them because we're going to be spending 3 weeks on them. But let's look at some of the verses she quotes. And this idea that from the Brihad, okay, on the top of page 30, or rather the bottom of page 29, and here we see this notion of, but both monotheism and monism, there's one kind of source. Whether it's personal or impersonal is a secondary issue. Whether the souls remain individual or don't is a secondary issue, but they both have the word monism and monotheism, so there's one ultimate absolute truth. Okay, so here we get some sense of that. In the earliest of the Upanishad, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, page 29, in the beginning, quote, right before the grey box, this world was just being. Okay, learn the word for that. Sat. Sat is the word for being. One only without a second. That's mono. It is true that some people say, in the beginning the world was just non-existence, asat, one only without a second, and from that non-existence being emerged. Now notice there was speculation already in the early Brihad. Some people say this, and some say that, and some say this. It wasn't so. The Upanishads are not dogmatic. They are full of sort of speculation and different possibilities are engaged. So it's true some say that there was asat, non-being, but continuing on the page, top of page 30, but how could that possibly be, says the author of this passage? How could being come from non-existence? How can something come from nothing? Nothing comes from nothing. Something comes from something. It doesn't come from nothing. Okay? So physicists might say matter is neither created nor destroyed, right? Just sort of recirculates. Something like that. If there's something, it must come from something. It can't come from nothing. Nothing does not produce something. So how could that be? How could that possibly be the case? How could being come from non-existence, asat? On the contrary, in the beginning, this world was just being, one only, without a second. Now, you could see that passage could work for a monist, but it could work for a monotheist. They'd both agree on that. Of course, they have to agree on it because so from the Upanishads comes the Vedānta tradition. These notions of monism and monotheism are going to be especially associated with the Vedānta tradition. Okay, Vedānta. They have a Vedānta sutra, and they emerge from the Upanishads, and their job is to try to clarify what it says. This passage here in the Upanishads said this. It seems to be monistic, but this other passage is monotheistic. How do we remember? Vedas are eternal. They're perfect. They can't be inconsistent. So the job of Vedānta is to come up with a systematic hermeneutics. Remember hermeneutics, a consistent way of interpreting the Upanishads, such that one can construe a consistent meaning. So that's the kind of passage you're going to find in the Upanishads. When we, after we finish Hamilton, we'll dive straight into the Upanishads. And here's a few more. Following that, it is by seeing, hearing, reflecting, and concentrating on one's essential nature, essential self, the Ātman, that the whole world is known. So the next quote, right? 5 lines down on page 30. That the idea of just, if you know your Ātman, you know everything. Because somehow Ātman is connected somehow with Brahman. Remember, monists would say, how is it connected? Well, it can merge eventually. Monotheists would say, no, you never merge. But still, if you know God and you're connected to God, then you know everything. So they both sign off on these statements of the Upanishads. Okay, again, that's the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the oldest Upanishad. And then another quote. The Ātman is below, above, to the west, east, south, and north. The Ātman is indeed the whole world. The idea is that the Ātman is potentially infinite. Even if it's an individual, whether it's monistic or an individual, it can actually, its quality of consciousness can actually become infinite. We'll find that developed in yoga. Right? What's trapping its consciousness? If you think, right, now I'm a human, let's say I die, become an ant. Well, then I'm only conscious of the ant's body, and the ant sees and whatever its range of awareness is. But then I die, become an elephant. The ant dies and become an elephant. Now its sphere of consciousness expands, fills up the whole body of the elephant and the central range of the elephant. So that means consciousness can expand and contract. The elephant can die, become an ant. So now its consciousness contracts. So what does that mean? That means that potentially consciousness can expand and contract. It's limited only by its embodiment. So we'll take away the body then, in liberation. So why can't that quality of consciousness expand infinitely? So most schools will accept that. So that's what this verse is saying, right? It is indeed the whole world. So there we have it. These are the Upanishads. Don't need to say too much about them now, but here we start to see a move away from Vedic ritualism, not a rejection of Vedic ritualism, but that's no longer the primary concern. Some of these speculators are still doing their Vedic rituals, by the way, but the Upanishads, that's no longer the central concern. All right. If we look at the Vedic canon, the Brahmanas, the second strata of texts, are all about ritual. We're going to see two schools are going to emerge from this Vedic corpus that are very, very concerned about interpreting and following and preserving the Vedic corpus. There's going to be the Mimamsa school and the Vedānta school. Well, what's the difference between them? The Mimamsa school are interested in the older parts and they want to preserve the rituals. They're the ritual specialists. They're chanting the mantras and throwing things in the fire. And, if you wanted to be a cynic or a Marxist, you could say their livelihood gets threatened. People are moving away from the ritual. So, they survive off donations for doing rituals. I'm not a cynic, but there are Marxists and they would take that lens. But you could just say that I prefer to say that they believed in what they were doing. They've been done for generations. And, Brahmanas are supposed to live simply. It's not that they're, the ideal Brahmana in the text is not supposed to be living a life of luxury. It's supposed to be extremely, in some texts it says whatever you receive in the morning in donation, you have to give it away by night. Some texts say stuff like that. Other texts talk about Brahmins being donated whole villages and stuff. So we get different statements. We can't oversimplify or essentialize. But nonetheless, their way of life is being undermined. Buddhism breaks off, Jainism, they become powerful philosophers. They start critiquing these ritualistic, not the rites, but the mindset, this lusty mindset, like lusty in the sense that you do Vedic rituals to get material things. So those traditions that are less interested in material things and they want liberation of the deepest level thing, the Ātman, they then start looking at ritualism as a kind of, maybe not a waste of time, but a sort of an activity for materialistically minded people. Okay, so we have that sense in the Upanishads, and certainly that's the direction that Vedānta is going to take. That's how they're going to interpret the Upanishads, with some differences between Vedānta scholars. Okay, so Upanishads then emphasis on oneness, whether that's monism or monotheism. She stresses monism, in my view, incorrectly, because both possibilities are there, and both give rise to powerful schools that remain to this day. Shankara, Advaita Vedanta, 1200 years old, going back to Shankara in the 8th, 9th century. Ramanuja, 12th century. Madhva, 13th century. Powerful schools that still dominate the religious or are powerful presences on the religious landscape of India to this day. All right, so there we have it. So now, so another way of thinking of these, so therefore we have these, I don't think I finished that. So the Mimamsas are concerned with the older Vedas, the hymns that are recited during the sacrifice, which are hymns of praise to the gods. Oh Indra, these are Rig Vedic hymns. Oh Indra, you are so powerful. I am your devotee. Give me rain. If I were you, Indra, and someone worshipped me like I'm worshipping you, I would bestow rain upon them. So sometimes the hymns are cajoling. Sometimes they're all supplicatory. They're making supplications. They're asking for things. So there's the hymns, and then the Brahmanas, the prose manuals that tell you how to do the sacrifice. The Mimamsas are concerned with those two. Vedantins are concerned are not interested in that at all. Barely quote that. Occasionally, if they find the odd verse that works for them, like the Rig Vedic hymn, perhaps something like that. But they're interested in the Upanishads and the talk about Brahman and Ātman. Brahman, the ultimate truth. What's underpinning this cycle of rain? What's behind the rain and the gods? What's behind this whole cycle of ritual and the Dharma of the universe? What are more ultimate truths? What's supporting that whole system? Brahman. So they become interested in Brahman, and what about that spark of Brahman that is within us? You could call it Brahman, but usually it's called an Ātman. By the way, the term Ātman and Brahman sometimes are interchangeable. Don't get confused. Usually Ātman is referring to the self within, and Brahman to the sort of cosmic self, but sometimes they're reversible. So sometimes Ātman is refers to. So there is this intimate relationship of Ātman and Brahman. Remember, some schools are going to say, well, it's intimate because they're the same thing. The drop of water is the ocean, but it certainly becomes the ocean when it hits the ocean. So that's why they're so closely connected. And others are going to say, no, the personalists that believe in God, that the Ātman is a spark of God. So yes, it's very intimate and it has the same qualities of God, but in a minuscule way and eternally different. So there is this intimate relationship between Ātman and Brahman, whether that's one of dualism and distinction or monism and merger, is an issue that divides the Vedanta schools. I hope that's reasonably clear. If it's not, it will become so when we get to the Vedanta. Okay, for now, right, hope we have a sense of the Vedic canon, hymns chanted during the sacrifice, Brahmana texts, prose information about how to do the ritual. That becomes the concern of the Mimamsa, one of the 6 schools of Indian philosophy, the Mimamsa, let's say it properly, all long Mimamsa. Then we have the Upanishads, the last of the 4 strata of the Vedic canon, and that's it. And then everything else is post-Vedic or late Vedic, like Puranas and the Mahabharata, the epics, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Gita. That's all post. And the sutras, we're going to be studying texts from the 6 sutra texts from the 6 schools, or 5 and a substitute. And that's all. It might have its roots in the Upanishads. They all have their roots in the Upanishads, but they actually are considered post-Vedic. Okay, so there we are. And now we're going to turn, I think we've covered everything. Oh, one other thing that she says on the last page, 33. So this ritualistic activity later on gets called the Kanda, is a section of the Vedas, right? I've divided them into 4, but you can also think of them as 2, the ritualistic section and the philosophical section, right? Because the Vedas and the Brahmanas are the ritual section, and the Upanishads are the philosophical, and Aranyakas, remember, just have a bit of this and a bit of that. They're probably more closely connected to the Upanishads, but we really don't worry about, scholars don't really direct much attention to the Aranyakas. They don't have much of a raison d'être of their own. That's very clear. They don't have much of a nature of their own. So therefore, you can also think of it as 2 strata. The four strata are divided into two basic divisions. The first 2, the Vedas and the Brahmanas, are the Karmakanda, karma, remember here meaning the ritual, and its results. Karma in the very, very early just meant work, it meant action, it meant ritual action, and then of course that produced a result. But karma actually means work. But of course in the Indian understanding, going back to the Rig Veda, if you did something, inherent in that work is its reaction. We think of it as 2 different things, action and reaction, as if they're 2 different things. Well, the Vedic way of thinking was that, there's one word. You didn't have 2 words, action and reaction. You have one word, karma, but within karma is the initial act, but that's connected to its result. You can't separate that. So sort of 2 notions embedded in the word karma. Karma meant the word work, and every work has a reaction, so that's there automatically. So the old 2 texts of the Mimamsas, concern of the Mimamsas, that's the Karmakanda, the 2 words on page 33, and the Jnana, right? You need to know this word, one of your 50 words, Jnana, knowledge, remember? We actually mentioned it's cognate with kna, knowledge, kno, gna, Jnana, gnosis of the Greeks. So the Ganakanda is the Upanishads. That's where you get knowledge, not just ritual and how to perform ritual, that's work, but knowledge. Well, what's behind it all? Who am I? Who am I in a deep level? If I do my rituals, I go to celestial realms. Well, who's going to the celestial realms? What is that? And then the Ātman then becomes the primary focus. And what's the point of going to the celestial realms anyway if I have to come back down? How is there a way of just not being reborn at all? So these kinds of concerns then emerge in the Upanishads. So they're known as the Jnana Kanda. Okay, Karma Kanda. Kanda means a division. Karma Kanda, work, ritual, and its results. The Vedas and the Brahmanas, and that becomes those 2 the Karmakanda texts. Those 2 texts are of central importance to the Mimamsa school, and the Upanishads then are of concern to the Vedānta school and other schools, but especially Vedānta, and that's the Ganakanda. Kanda, same word, Ganakanda. Okay, so we'll stop that there.